Mhm.
Hello, friends. This is Alexi Bailey, and I'm the host of the Tell It Like It Is podcast. Today, I have a very special guest, Mark Zuctovich.
Alexi, how's it going? How are you?
Feeling good, Mark. Thank you so much for taking the time.
Anytime.
Mark, how was your day?
Well, it's we're getting back into the grind of office work. I was home, working from home for about probably 20 months before heading back to the office in September. I work for the city of New York. So we're getting accustomed to getting back on the subway and meeting our coworkers in face to face again, and trying to remember the way to the kitchen and to the bathroom. But it's been fine, and I think it's as you do it day by day, you get a little more comfortable with getting out into the public, the masses again. But it's been going well. It's been going well. I think like everyone else, everything is an adjustment these days.
What do you do for the city, Mark?
So I work for the New York City Department of Youth and Community Development. Our agency funds the city's youth programs, everything from after school to runaway and homeless youth. Those are obviously young people who have been either kicked out of their home, they've run away, they're seeking shelter, things like that. We do adult literacy. We have a number of programs that deal with mostly youth, but also adults as well, and a little bit of seniors here and there, and immigrants as well.
How did you get into that work?
Well, it was, honestly, I was a broadcaster for 25 years, mostly radio, but I did television and newspapers as well. And, like everything in life, you do it for a while, you get kind of tired. It's a grind, covering a lot of stories, not all of them happy stories. And I decided to leave after 25 years and pursue things outside of journalism. One of the first things I did is I worked for a nonprofit in New Jersey for 3 years. And then there was an opening in government. I worked for the Brooklyn Borough president initially, was there for, let's see, 6 or 7 years. And then I started at my current agency in 2013. So it was just a matter of just progressing from one place to another. I always wanted to work in the youth field. That's been one of my passions as an adult. So the opportunity came about, and honestly, it was great getting into government and having a predictable schedule every day where you know what time you're going in, what time you have to leave, what holidays you have off. When I was a broadcaster, there was no such thing as weekends or nighttime or holidays, So yeah, it's been an incredible ride. And as you're aware, we're about to change administrations here in New York City, new mayor taking office on January 1st. So right now we're preparing for that transition.
Who won the election?
That was Eric Adams. He'll be the next mayor of the city of New York. I've actually worked under 3 mayors now, Michael Bloomberg, Bill de Blasio, and now Eric Adams in January.
What's Eric's story?
Eric is currently the Brooklyn Borough president. He actually took over that position from my former boss. Marty Markowitz was the Brooklyn Borough president. And he took over after Marty was term limited, couldn't run again. He is a former police officer with the city of New York, senator, and very active in politics and also policing. And we'll see, starting in January, we're excited to see how, what direction he'll take the city in. And of course, we're especially eager to see, what priorities will be placed on the young people of New York City, particularly.
Was he your pick?
Oh, listen, I can't comment on anything to do with. I never discuss who I vote for, who I don't vote for. Yeah, no, that's.
I hear you. I'm
just excited. That's all.
I had to press. What was that first nonprofit you did?
So it was an organization called Recording for the Blind and Dyslexic, and we actually put textbooks, not only educational textbooks, but also fun reading like Harry Potter. On back then, the technology was audio cassettes, And it would enable people who were either visually impaired or had dyslexia. They were able to listen to the text in addition to, if they could, read it. So it kind of helped them in their learning process and to comprehend better. And yeah, it was an amazing job. I traveled across the country and met our different chapters across the country, got to meet a lot of people. And then, like I said, that was in New Jersey, actually. It's right near you, actually. It was down in central New Jersey. And then it was time for the big move back to New York City, which I was eager to do again. I had previously lived there. I grew up on Long Island. So yeah, that's kind of the trajectory that I went on there.
And what did you do in broadcasting?
So broadcasting, I started when I was a young old cub of 19 years old. I got my first job. I was a disc jockey, actually. I was a terrible disc jockey. I mean, it really was awful. I mean, I had no training except for a few broadcasting classes. I got my first job. It was in Northwest New Jersey, up near Easton, Pennsylvania, Stroudsburg, that area up there. And I got my first job doing disc jockey work. And after about a year of doing that, actually it was a few months of doing that, the news director of the radio station said to me, "We have a full-time position opening up for news. Are you interested?" And at first I was kind of like, I don't know, news, that sounds kind of dry and boring, you know? But I said yes, it was a full-time gig and I took it. And I ended up loving it. And after about a few months working there, I got hired away at a radio station in Princeton, New Jersey. And I worked there for, I have to go back in my mind now. How long was I there? I was there almost 10 years, right?
What station is that?
So I'm not sure if it's still there. It's WHWH AM and WPST FM. I believe WPST is still there. It might be a different frequency than when I was there. But yeah, we had a dual radio station. So I did news for both stations. And I rose to the rank of news director, and then I became operations manager. And then I got hired by 1010 Winds Radio in New York, which was an amazing experience. I started there in 1994 and I left in 2004. So obviously during that period of time, I covered incredible stories, and I was there for 9/11. And
so were you behind the camera? Where, like?
So I was mostly in radio. So it's always behind the camera, thankfully, because I don't like this is not my, but yeah, no, I was a reporter, on-air reporter. So
you were on air.
Yes, I was on air.
10 years you were on air at 1010 Winds.
Correct. Except my name was not the name that I used.
Okay. Yeah, I can hear the voice.
Yeah, back in the day, not so much now at all, but back in the day, they didn't like ethnic sounding names in radio or television. They encouraged you to simplify your name to something that sounds, every day.
Right.
And for me, it was just using a name that, so I've been told my mother wanted to name me Brian when I was a baby. So I just took the name Brian. I made it a little, Irish ethnic's okay for a last name. So I made it O'Brien. So Mark O'Brien was my air name for the whole entire time I was in broadcasting. From the time I started to the day I left, that was my name.
Did you ever make the mistake of saying I'm Mark?
Yes, a couple of times I did. It's so easy to do. Yeah, it's pretty incredible how easy it is to slip back to that. But it's really funny. I have tapes of all my broadcasting years, and recently we did a 9/11 retrospective. 1010 Winds did one, and they contacted me to think back to the day and what it meant and everything else. And I was listening back to some of my reports from that time. For the first time, I've heard them in 20 years. And to me, it was incredible. And this is not pumping myself up or anything, but I was really amazed about, under the circumstances of that day, how calm and professional my recording sounded, my voice. I compare it back to those first disc jockey, tapes from 1986 when I was terrible. And it amazed me how much,
where's the studio?
1010 Wins.
Yeah.
At the time they were on 7th Avenue near Central Park.
Okay.
But they've since moved. They're in Chelsea now, I believe. That move happened after I had left already. But I worked out of New Jersey, so I was pretty much working out of Trenton at the State House, and also.
So you're telling me on 9/11 you were in Trenton reporting on
9/11? I was actually home. At the time I lived in East Windsor, New Jersey. And I woke up that morning, and like everyone else, I had my television on. I'm getting ready to do my work day. I'm getting ready to cover whatever the news was going to be that day. And then everything changed, of course. So they immediately sent me to Newark Airport. Obviously, one of the planes at United Flight 93 had taken off from Newark. So I went to Newark to cover that angle of it. We had plenty of reporters already at the scene at Ground Zero. So they wanted to get some other angles to the story. So they sent me to Newark. Yeah.
So how long were you at the airport?
Well, I was at the airport for hours, several hours that day. But over the course of the next few days, they had me go in different locations in New Jersey. The first time I actually went to Ground Zero was about maybe 7 or 8 days after 9/11 was my first time there. And when I got there, it was still smoldering and still very kind of chaotic. I have very, very vivid memories of that time. It doesn't quite escape you,
Is it like all ash kind of thing?
Yeah, and I remember coming home back to East Windsor and taking off my boots because I was wearing like boots because you never knew what you were going to step on there in terms of glass or anything else. I remember taking off my boots, and I had a cat, and the cat went up to the boots and started sniffing them. And I suddenly got this strange, sensation that I don't know what's on those boots, and those are the kind of things that you kind of remember from that time, the sensory things.
Right.
I remember the cloud, the cloud of smoke from the World Trade Center over as far away as East Windsor, which is a good hour or so south of New York City, southwest. So
about 50 miles.
Yeah, exactly. It was covering the neighborhood, in the sky, and yeah, it was one of those times. I have many memories of broadcasting, but that one obviously is the one that stands out as one of the most impactful. Yeah.
I don't know. 9/11, it's one of those things that I try to implant in my kids' minds. What is the takeaway from 9/11, you would say, to a kid who wasn't there or someone who doesn't get it or know?
Right. I mean, I think two things. The first thing is this, I would say, a false sense of security we all tend to have, especially where you live, what country you live in, that can vary. But I think here in the United States, we have, unfortunately, a very false sense of security, and that all of the best systems and all the best precautions and everything's going to take care of us. But as we learned over time, from 9/11 to Katrina, to even the most recent, the bad flooding we had in the New York City area, we're never quite as safe as we think we are. But I think the other thing too is, and this is another unfortunate after effect of 9/11, you remember and I remember, there was so much unity right after. I remember it didn't matter what political stripe you were, it didn't matter where, everyone had kind of a common goal of rebuilding and helping out and supporting. And we all just kind of agreed that we have to get back on our feet. And sadly, I think between 2001 and today, somewhere we lost that path.
We kind of went back to business as usual.
We did. I mean, you think about the pandemic. It was difficult for us to all agree on the way to deal with the pandemic. We couldn't come together. We couldn't agree to set aside whatever preconceived notions or beliefs that we had for the sake of keeping other people and ourselves safe, right? So I think for children, it's really tough these days. And one of the challenges we face at the agency dealing with young people is there are so many influences bombarding them every single day.
Right.
Things I never had as a kid. My world was limited to the things I could see and hear around me, and television, right? But now the kids are getting so many different mixed messages and so much, social media is just every day. It's just this, and we quite honestly do not know everything they're seeing and everything they're hearing. We like to think we do, but we don't.
We don't.
And you know that as a dad, you always have to be very, very wary of exactly what material they're looking at and who they're connecting with. So I think the challenges for young people today, growing up, are certainly, there's a lot of commonalities to when I was growing up, but I think it's much more difficult, much more difficult. And so I hope, I always hope, because I'm a hopeful person, I hope that we all find a way in this country to set aside our differences, and finally get on the path that we should be on. Right now, honestly, we're not there yet, not even close. So yeah.
It sounded like you didn't have a big background in political science, journalism, all of these kinds of things. So
Mhm.
go ahead, go ahead.
No, in terms of before I became a journalist, you mean?
Right, right.
Yeah, no, I didn't. I did not. In fact, I didn't go to college until I was 37 or 38 years old. I got my bachelor's degree when I was 41. So I never went to college. I'm totally self-taught. I taught myself everything. I've been working nonstop since I was a teenager. So everything I learned about politics, everything I learned about broadcasting and journalism was my own concoction.
So what perspective did that give you?
Um, well, first of all, sometimes we get so bogged down in learning and being educated and getting a degree that we kind of sometimes lose focus of common sense and street knowledge, because street knowledge is really, really important. I think, my dad, my late dad, God bless him, used to always tell me that I always knew as a child, I knew what 2 + 2 were equal. I knew it was 4, but I couldn't tell you why it equaled 4. And what he meant by that was I was smart, I was book smart, but I wasn't street smart.
Mm.
So once I was on my own and living in New York City as a young person, I finally started to, get that common sense together. And like in broadcasting, yes, it's helpful to know how to write a sentence. It's helpful to know how to, write a story and put words together, but it's just as equally important to know what the story is and who to talk to and to really understand what someone's telling you. So, to me, I learned everything it was baptism by fire. They threw me in and I learned as I went, so.
I'm assuming you saw a lot of people who had those degrees. So what was the difference in perspective?
Well, it's funny. There were people that were much more educated than I was, who took a lot longer to rise to the ranks than I did, and sometimes it's luck. Sometimes you're in the right place, the right people. I'm not saying that it's totally based on of talent, but yeah, what was the difference? I don't know if there was a major difference. I think what happens is when you get stuck in academia, and if you get stuck in that world too much and rely on it too much, sometimes you kind of lose sight of I don't know. For
Yeah.
me, I always had a sense of people. I don't know where that really came from, because growing up on Long Island actually was quite isolated, meaning I lived out in what used to be called the country, and I grew up in an all-white town of 16,000 people. I didn't meet people from around the world until I left Long Island and moved to New York City and started working there. But I had an innate sense of people that I picked up by not being in college, but rather being in the workplace. So once I graduated high school, my first job was I worked on Wall Street. I worked 3 years for brokerage houses. And although the work wasn't exciting for me, it certainly gave me an exposure to people that was priceless. I met so many different people. And I just picked up on their stories. I learned about, honestly, I learned about poverty. I learned about racism. I learned about, the immigrant challenge, but just by knowing these people. And I think that helped me out greatly in my broadcasting career. I don't think if I had gone off to college, it's hard to say this, but I don't think if I went off to college and didn't have those experiences that I just described to you, I don't think I would have the same perspective.
Right.
Yeah, not at all.
Yeah,
Not
and
at
I
all.
think that's kind of like what I'm trying to tap into, right?
Yeah,
Um, you know, th th this is a big work that we're talking about here, you know. I think America has the potential to be um, that beacon on the hill that we always said we were. But I think, you know, we're getting mixed up in a lot of things, and I'm not, you know, like you said, you're a hopeful person. So what are you seeing right now? What, like, I mean, I can tell you, and you know, like I said, I try to let you tell it like it is. Um, but it's, you know, we're getting caught up in money over people.
yeah, yeah. I see a couple of things. I see the loss of the pursuit of intellectualism in this country. I don't mean everyone has to run around and be a brainiac, master's degree. I'm talking about an intellectual curiosity to learn, to hear both sides of a story, to make your own decisions that are unaffected by anyone around you or anything around you, and come to a reasoned, rational conclusion, right? That's it. And we've lost that ability. Why? Because we're saturated and bombarded every day with social media sound bites and misleading information. 24-hour cable news hasn't helped, in my opinion. Yeah, so I think the loss of intellectualism is one thing, but the other thing too is, and I always use this word, it's extremely important to me. We've lost empathy.
Mm.
Um, Empathy, simply is just the ability to even when you don't understand someone or agree with them, that empathetic feeling of they're a fellow human and I need to hear them out, or I need to hear their story. Maybe something about their story will change my mind. So yeah, we're at a bad place right now. And again, I don't want to be a downer, but I've been around a long time. I'll be 57 in February. And, I've never seen it this bad. Um, and I just think that if we took this more empathetic approach to everything and an intellectual curiosity about everything, I think we can at least get back on the road to what you describe, a beacon, in this country. I've
Yeah,
traveled around the world, Lexi, and I got to tell you, I've been to other countries, and I'm very brutally honest about this. Other countries do things better than we do. I know it's a shock for people to hear that, but other countries do things better than we do.
like what do you mean?
Education, the environment. There's investments in transportation infrastructure. I know we just had a major infrastructure bill just passed, but you go to other countries and you see high-speed rail, you're blown away. You're like, oh my God, this train's going, 200 miles an hour. And in this country, it's just a foreign concept to us, right? I always say there's no perfect system, right? But somewhere a marriage between the best of everything is kind of where you want to be, right? You want to be somewhere in that middle, right? I just think that sometimes in this country in particular, because we're raised in the United States, believing that we are the best country on earth, that often gets in the way of us really letting other things in that we really need to look at and say, maybe we can do that better. And I think right now we're kind of just like, no, we do it the best. We don't have to touch it. It's working just fine. Well, unfortunately, everything is working just fine, but not for the majority of people. That's the big problem.
I'm going to touch on a few of these, and then I'm going to ask you about what you were working on before the pandemic.
Okay.
So education, we know that the school system could be better, right? And
Right.
do you feel like it's intentional? Do you feel like it's an oversight? And the other thing is, the media is, in my opinion, oversaturating us with these messages. And is it an accident? Is this on purpose? And that goes hand in hand with the school. Like, if you don't educate them and then you oversaturate them with messages, keep them busy at work, and keep the different groups separated, giving them messages that divide them, you're kind of stirring a pot.
Mm-hmm. Well, this is I get where you're going, and this is the area where if you even discuss these topics, you start getting labeled different things, right? Like a conspiracy theorist or whatever. But the truth of the matter is, I'll say this: I don't know if it's intentional or not. I believe some of it is. I don't know if it's intentional or not, but the effects, the impact is the same. All those things you just said. We are divided, and we are. It seems like we're being manipulated to go a certain way. I'll tell you this: when I was coming up in broadcasting in the '80s, back in those days, the FCC had very strict oversight of radio and television. And in fact, at the radio stations I worked for, we had to provide a written log, regularly, that had to document that we devoted a certain amount of time to a certain amount of topics, and that we allowed both sides to speak on it. And if you violated anything, you get fined. So there was a lot of oversight. Then deregulation eventually broke that all apart, and today it's a free for all. So I grew up at a time when, my editors would get on me if I did not present a balanced story. The story would not air unless I had a balanced, perspective to it. That's out the window now. And I'm not saying it doesn't still exist. It does still exist. But for the most part, the media that the majority of people are consuming, the 24-hour cable news shows, not even the news programs, talking about the, MSNBC shows, the Laura Ingrams, the Sean Hannitys of the world, whatever your viewing habits are, you're getting this skewed perspective. So I always say, if you're going to watch those shows, great, watch them, but watch them all. Don't watch the ones that you agree with. Watch the other side too. Get a balanced perspective. I don't have a problem with that, but I have a problem with your entire world is based on the input you receive from one source or one type of source, right? So yeah, I get your question. I don't want to sound like there's some big evil plot going on, but I do believe that there are agendas at play in this country. And everyone has one, but the people with the power, they really can make their agendas happen, right? So I do believe there's an agenda in this country to steer us all a certain way, whatever way that is, right?
I like that word, steering, right?
Yeah.
So I don't even like the idea of conspiracy theories anymore because they're seen as crazy, right? I like to stay in the place that we can all agree on.
Yeah.
So if we can say like, hey, this isn't balanced news. If you can say like, if if there's it's so obvious at this point. It's not even worth debating or trying to, you know, people believe what they want to believe at this point. I'm just worried that things like hate crimes are being normalized now.
Mhm. Bad behavior is being normalized.
So, like, forget the crazy conspiracy. Like, now hate crimes are just like a part of American life. Like,
Yeah,
that's, you know, and at the same time, we have certain politicians who kind of keep saying these narratives that, I come back to things like the Asian flu, the Kung Fu, and these kinds of things. Like, when you perpetuate that, it's gonna have an impact, right? Like, you and I can kind of brush it off, but there are people out there who's eating it up.
yeah, absolutely. It's it becomes its own reality, and when you absorb all that to the absence of everything else, that is a scary place. And I think that's going back to the empathy thing again, right? It's, for me, it's like, if we had empathy for our fellow humans, no matter what their background, no matter where they come from, no matter what their political positions are, I think if you start at that point, you can at least be fair in assessing this information you're receiving, right? But if you're just doing it just to create your own reality, which is what's happening, and worse, creating havoc, for the rest of the world, that's happening also. Yeah, the issue of hate crimes is troubling in so many different ways. I think because, why, we're in 2021, and we should know better by now. We should be at a place now where we're moving forward and treating people with dignity and respect, even when we don't agree with them. But again, we're not close to that yet. We're just not there. We're not even in the same ballpark yet.
But that's the thing, I think people's reality, it's being dictated by the media for the large part. And if the media never goes there, then we're always going to be in this racist cycle, this hate cycle, this who should we blame, and we're never going to evolve. So
yeah. I'm going to go back to, I'll say that the advent of 24-hour news was probably the turning point in what we're talking about here. Back in the day, of course, you had a half-hour news segment at night. You had it maybe, at 6 o'clock, 6:30, maybe one at 11. They didn't have a lot of content to fill back in the day. Now they have to fill 24 hours of programming. So you have to have something to keep people watching or listening, right? Talk radio is the same. You always have to keep people engaged. And, quite honestly, there's only so much content that can go around before you have to turn to or entertainment, info, whatever you want to call it, info entertainment, or whatever they want to call it now. But yeah, we are definitely influenced by the media, but social media also has to take a hit on this too, because that is a total. I mean, you talk about an agenda for news. The agenda of social media is, there is no agenda. It's all over the place. It's whatever you're reading that day. Certainly your timeline is what do they call that? What's the word? When curated. Your timeline is curated to increase sales, all that stuff. But there were really no filters on that.
Well, at the end, you kind of chose that. So you chose what you look for on there. And
correct.
I guess it's like choosing the channel you watch and all of these kinds of things.
Yeah. The difference is that even when you choose something, the other stuff kind of just bleeds through there, right? Even no matter how many times you filter your timeline, you're still getting the garbage on there. It's hard to avoid.
What was the work you were doing before the pandemic?
Well, it was business as usual.
But what were your priorities? What kind of objectives did you have?
Professionally or personally?
Professionally.
Professionally. I'm trying to remember before the pandemic. What was that, March of 2020? When you work in government, there's a kind of a rhythm to government, right? It's every day you come in and there are things to be done and programs to keep running. So in terms of professional priorities, to me, that was it. I mean, just coming in, making sure that, people knew about what we were doing. That my job at the agency is public information. So I'm responsible for making sure that, the information about the agency gets out to the public, either through the press or through other channels. And so my priority was just to keep on pushing forward, right? We have this administration had an agenda for young people and seeing that out,
So tell us a little bit. What do your work is to let people know about the work of the agency. So tell us a
Right.
little bit about the agency and.
So our agency is primarily a contracting agency, as opposed to, say, the Department of Health, for example, which actually provides programs. Their staff is out there doing the programming, correct? At our agency, we fund organizations, nonprofits that do the on the street work. So we contract and fund them, and they in turn carry out the programming. So, for example, we will have a contract for a shelter system or a homeless system like California Center, for example. So we would fund them. They would carry out the operational part of that contract. So they would be the ones that greet the young people when they come into the shelter. They would be the ones that provide them, clothing and food and services, mental health services. So in our agency, we're in the back office, making sure everything stays functioning, right? Whereas other agencies, people like Department of Sanitation, for example, the collectors are actually out in the streets, as you know, collecting trash, right? They don't sit in the office and collect trash; they're out there, right? So we have to make sure that the public is always aware of our agency and the role that we play. While we may not actually be the ones out there doing the work, we are the ones making sure that it's getting done. And certainly we act in an advisory capacity as well. We're always working with our providers to make sure that the programs are the highest quality they can be. So for me, the example of that would be maybe I would call up New York One, for example, and have them cover one of our programs. They can come to the school or the community center. They can talk to our kids. They can talk to the provider, find out what kind of services are available there, and let New Yorkers know they can contact us and call our toll-free hotline and find out more about services that are available. So that's kind of the primary responsibility of my role.
So anything for young people, New York City is trying to provide for them.
Correct. Yep.
I worked for Covenant House for a while.
So Covenant House is one of our providers. Yes. Yep. They provide some of our, we call it RHY, which is Runaway and Homeless Youth Services. Yeah.
Yeah, I talk a lot about them because they were, fresh out of college. I went straight to Covenant House. I was down there on 42nd Street, greeting youth who were homeless and doing that work. I did homeless services in New York City for 10 years. So.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
It's very rewarding work when you see what you can do, but it's also very difficult work, as you know. It's emotionally very challenging, and I think that was one of the adjustments that we've all had to make since COVID. Is, at least for me, dealing with our own daily lives and emotions and roller coaster emotions and traumas and all those things that we're trying to absorb for ourselves, and then having to professionally help others as well. So it was that extra layer, I think, that's been difficult to adjust to. And listen, during COVID, we were very fortunate. We managed to keep majority of our programs up and running. But a lot of people, especially young people, suffered during that time greatly, especially those that, like you've worked with, that have no place to go. And it was dangerous, quite honestly, being out there, not knowing who they're around, if people were infected. We had no, So it was a challenge. It was a challenge. And I think, one of the things that I've kind of pivoted in my life um, is kind of getting away from too much of advocacy work for me because of that intense emotional part of it. I think one of the, if you ask any person that's out there doing on the ground advocacy or activist work, they'll tell you one of the first casualties of that is their mental health. It's it's demanding work. It's hard work. You probably go through every day not getting what you want, not seeing the change that you were hoping for, seeing people die. It's very difficult work. And over time, I found myself kind of, I think this is a natural part of aging, is that, you tend to gravitate towards things when you get older that bring you a little more peace and a little more emotional stability.
Right.
So while so while my workday concentrates on that continuing work that we do with young people, outside of work, I think COVID changed this tremendously. For me personally, is I've pivoted to things that bring me more joy. You
Like
know,
what?
well, for me, the outdoors is one of those things that I just need a regular dose of, hiking, um, camping, getting out into the mountains. I went to the Rocky Mountains for the first time in my life this past year.
Nice.
It's just beautiful. So I like to devote a lot of time to that. My genealogy, my family history, I love doing that. The COVID pandemic gave me a lot of opportunities to work on that. So researching, finding facts about my family, I just love. And quite honestly, Alexi, this is how you and I met. Running's always like in my mind. In fact, every time I watch the marathon, like I did just a week ago, I get that bug all over again. It comes back. I remember after I did the 2013 New York City Marathon, I said, I'm not doing this again. There is no way I'm doing this again. And I did it again the next year, So I want to get back into some serious running again. I love the community of that. And yeah, and same thing with hiking. I just absolutely, I love the outdoor community. They're a close-knit group. And yeah, I think like a lot of people, I hope a lot of people, finding those things that bring you joy during the pandemic really kind of shifted my mindset.
Where on Long Island did you grow up?
So I grew up in a town called Sayville. It's in Suffolk County. It's about an hour and 15 minutes east of New York City. Like I said, when I was a baby, when I was born, it was pretty rural. Over time, it became much more suburban. Now it's what we call a suburb. It's connected by the Long Island Railroad. It has its own stop. So
wait, so what did you remember? Like, what was your rural memories like?
So when I was growing up as an infant, we had a huge, like my house was in this neighborhood. We had a huge woods behind us, nothing but woods. I would climb trees, build tree forts. I would like play on the dirt mounds and all that kind of stuff. I always had free reign around my house. Then when I was about 8 years old, they developed it. So they took the woods away and they put a whole bunch of houses up. And after that, it was like every other suburban neighborhood. I would hang out with my neighbors, my friends, but I wouldn't call it rural. That's probably not a good word. When I was an infant and a child, I would just call it, well, we called it the sticks, of course. That's the way we referred to it. And people in the city, when I told them I lived in Sayville, like, oh, you lived out there in the sticks. I'm like, well, I don't know if that's what you would call it, but it was definitely a place where, especially during that time when I was growing up, it was a place where you could be safe. I mean, we would walk around the neighborhood without our adult supervision. I could take my bike out and go around the neighborhood. We would talk to neighbors. Neighbors would let us into their homes. They would give us cookies and milk, and there was none of this angst and fear about your children, where they were. So I had an idyllic childhood. You know, we had a pond near our house that froze over. A lot of times in the winter, we used to go ice skating. Uh, it's like a Norman Rockwell painting kind of a place. Um, but there is, on the flip side, there is some, there's a bubble, you know, a sheltered bubble that kind of gets created. That's not necessarily the best thing. At least it wasn't for me. So when I turned 18, I started venturing out into New York City. And this was during the 80s in New York City. Wasn't exactly the same city as it was today. Crime was much higher. The crack epidemic was coming, you know, on the horizon. It was not the city that we see today. However, it was, everyone wanted to be there. It was the creative hub of the world. You know, you could live there for relatively inexpensive rent. You know, it was just a dynamic place to be. And I couldn't wait to get there. I was so excited, and I got there. And that got me out of my bubble, thankfully. And
What
it was
kind
a
of
good transition.
messages, what kind of messages did you grow up hearing about the others and people outside?
Well, they weren't always positive. Let me put it that way. Yeah, it's, and think at the time too. I grew up. I'm a Gen Xer, so I grew up in the 60s and 70s and 80s. Um, so it was a different time. Not to excuse it, but it was a different time.
Sure.
And all of the preconceived beliefs and notions that I had about other people that didn't look like me were primarily based on two things: the way they were depicted on television, that was huge, and the way your family and your neighbors spoke about them. And yeah, it wasn't always positive. I'm being nice when I say that. It wasn't always positive. I had to, when I, you know, started working in Manhattan when I was 18 years old. I remember walking into my office for the first day on Wall Street, and I looked in it back then. No one had cubicles or offices. There was a big open space. 80 to 90% of the office was Black, West Indian, right? And my first thought wasn't, oh my God, I can't work with all these people. My first reaction is they're not going to like me. They're going to see right, they're going to hate me. They're going to see this white boy from Long Island, and they're not going to like me at all. That was the reverse kind of thinking I had going on. So it was very, very intimidating to me. But you know what? It's just like, you know, I started just listening, talking, you know, before I knew it, I was going over my friends' houses. I was eating their native food. You know, I have one friend, I still to this day, we're still friends. He's from St. Vincent, the Grenadines. And I was eating all his island cooking. And I just loved learning and absorbing and making friends. I was so excited. And when I came back to Long Island, the times I would visit, I got a few looks, you know, like when I started telling stories, they didn't quite know what to make of this, of where I was. I guess they weren't sure if it was a positive thing or not. I can assure you it was absolutely the most positive experience of my life. I loved it. Loved it.
I mean, all right. So much of the podcast, it's about understanding where we're coming from, like the good old days. You know, I tend to use this idea of the good old days, not the good old days because it was perfect, not the good old days because there was good intent everywhere, but the good old days because it was simpler, slower. And I think the things that were wrong, that, you know, the racism and the bad messages that existed then were not as intense, you know, those kinds of things. I think that things are just getting like there's a pot stirring, you know. um I was having a conversation recently, and well, listen, there's a lot of things, right? There's so many things. um Before we get into that, you said you were interested in a podcast. What were you thinking about?
Wow. Yeah. I've toyed with the idea. Obviously, it would be a natural progression from my radio days, right? You know, the audio part is easy to figure out, and for me, it would come naturally. The subject matter I'm really interested in has to do with men's issues, and I think one of the effects of what you and I have been talking about during this, the division and the not seeing each other eye to eye. I think we're all suffering on some level in terms of mental health.
Mhm.
The different challenges that we face every day, but I think men still face an inordinate amount of those challenges for various reasons. But the most paramount one is that we just don't know how to speak. We don't know how to seek help. We don't know how to, be vulnerable. None of these things, right? So I've always been really deeply interested in having conversations and engaging not only men, but women as well, into how can we make men better and healthier, right? Because I think if we can get men to be in a good place, I think everything else will kind of fall into place, but right now, what I see, and maybe you see this in your own circles as well, what I see are a bunch of people, especially men, just struggling every day to make sense of this world and feeling more isolated than ever before because of COVID, but also because our societies is generally kind of drifting apart. You would think that social media and technology would bring us closest together, and it does, like in this way, but there's still that isolation of physicality, of not being in the same space as someone else, right? So my podcast, I really wanted to kind of dive into those issues, and I found that when I was looking at some preliminary guests and people that I wanted to have on my show, people were like, yeah, I'm dying to talk about that. I want this to happen. They were excited. And so we mentioned before the show that, you have to really feel like it's the right time and the right place. And you have to have the
So
right
is it like
energy.
like the kind of like men's issues in terms of like, I know there's an issue with like suicide,
Mhm.
suicide kind of thing. And,
Yes.
the other thing that came to mind was like the Me Too movement and
Mhm.
understanding that kind of thing.
Yeah, I mean, that's definitely all part of it. One of the, we keep on hearing the phrase toxic masculinity, and it's an interesting phrase. A lot of people don't like that phrase. And I'm not saying I'm married to it, that has to be the phrase, but the concept is dead on, and that is that men are taught from the womb, right? They're taught to be a certain way. And I'd be curious to know what it's like. You were born and raised in
Jamaica, West Indies.
Jamaica, right? So I would be curious to know what it was like there. But for me, growing up in the United States, especially during the 60s and 70s and 80s, I was taught that, a man was supposed to be the certain thing. They were supposed to be the provider. They were supposed to be strong. They were supposed to go out and get the jobs. They were supposed to have the children. They were supposed to, be protectors. Yeah, and you get into life and you realize, yes, those things are nice. And if you can balance that all out and be all those things, wonderful. But I find most men are ill-equipped to take on all that responsibility. And when you talk about Me Too, that's what happens when bad masculinity or bad manhood goes unchecked. You start falling back on things that are not so healthy. And that not only affects you, but obviously affects the people in your life, your loved ones as well. So I think men are more aware of all this now. I think there's more of awareness of it than there has been. But I still think we're kind of stuck in this place that we can't seem to get out of. And listen, the stuff going on in the country is not helping. The political unrest, the divisiveness, the violence, the issue of weapons and mass shootings, and all those things are not helping young men, especially, find, find their way.
I definitely, men are more violent, right? So what you're saying is you want to get in underneath that and unpack that. Like,
Exactly.
why are men violent, and what are we doing to perpetuate this amongst our men?
Why are men so unhappy? Why are suicide rates so much exponentially higher for men than women? There's a reason for that. Why are most violent crimes committed by men? There's a reason for that. Why are most sexual assaults committed by men? There's a reason for that, right? Yeah, there's something behind all that. There always has been.
What's your hypothesis?
I think the hypothesis is that what I just spoke about, the fact that these are indoctrinated traits. These are things that we hear over.
Boys will be boys.
What's that?
Boys will be boys.
That's right. That's right. Boys will be boys. And I think that becomes part of your DNA after a while, right? So it's just becomes who you are. But I think also, despite all the progress we've made in this world in terms of different groups, and we've made certainly a lot of progress in acceptance of others, we have a long way to go. I still think that there's a certain perception that men have to be a certain way. I'll give you an example. We hear all the time, a woman she'd had a baby, right? And she wants to have family leave and stay home. Great. She should. And I think we should give every opportunity for, families to raise their children if they have to work. But if a man says, I want to stay home and raise my child, there's a kind of still a weird thing about that, right? Like, what's up with him? Like, what do you mean he wants to stay home, right? So whether it's an very obvious pressure put on them, or that kind of subtle pressure, those little side eyes and that look, I think men are constantly bombarded with these old notions of what it means to be a man, and it quite honestly is deadly. It can, in its worst form, it's deadly.
All right. So we're going to take a short break, and then we're going to come back with some of the questions that we had talked about before, and just basically talking more about what you've seen in the LGBT movement and how that incorporates into all of this. So let's hold on for a brief break. Thanks, Hugh, so far.